Years have seen growing awareness among scholars of the reciprocity of law and religion and the interdependency of the two concepts as related taxonomies and orders of categorization. It has been emphasized, moreover, that the emerging realization of the inherent interconnectedness of law and religion depends, to a large extent, on our ability to transcend the division of logos and nomos rooted in certain readings of Paul, which essentially reject the idea of nomos as a medium of divine revelation and the manifestation or embodiment of God in favor of logos theology. In contrast to this view, for many law-observing Jews, Muslims, and Zoroastrians, God was and still is perceived as the ultimate source of the law, in which his word, will, and eternal wisdom are manifest. The assumption that God is the authorial and authoritative source of a normative and binding religious legal code, that logos and nomos are in fact different sides of the same coin, has a history that requires unfolding. The present lecture, devoted to one aspect of the symbiotic relations of law and religion, will focus on the intersection of legal and theological processes of canonization, which took place in the Geonic, Islamic, and Zoroastrian traditions in the 9th and 10th centuries. I will center on the contribution of Rav Shrira Gaon, the head of the Academy of Comparative, Al-Shafi, the so-called architect of Islamic jurisprudence, and Adul Fanbai and Manus Chir, both 9th century Zoroastrian jurists and high priests to these developments. I will argue that these more or less contemporaneous and adjacent authors similarly contributed to the legal and theological canonization of their respective religious corpora, the Quran and Hadith, the Mishnah and Babylonian Talmud, and Avesta and Zand, respectively, a process by which these works came to be regarded as the authoritative and binding sources of the law by virtue of divine revelation, and as legal codes embodying the divine word and combining God's logos and nomos. To be sure, even prior to the contribution of Shrira, Shafi, Adul Fanbai, and Manus Chir, all three religious traditions assumed, in one way or another, that the works under discussion reflect and partake in a broader notion of revealed law. This assumption, however, as we shall see, is a far cry from the rhetorical assertion that the Quran and Hadith, Mishnah and Talmud, and Avesta and Zan are the only authoritative and binding sources of God's law, embodying the totality of his revelation, the production of which was guided and orchestrated by God himself. Legal and theological canonization must be distinguished at the outset from the notion of textual canonization, that is, the establishment of a textually fixed version of a religious work. Legal and theological canonization, in this sense, transcend the mere crystallization of the sacred text in a fixed textual form, and focus instead on the relationship of the community to the text as a source of religious and legal normativity. As such, a process of legal and theological canonization, either or, can occur before or after the textual canonization of a given text in either oral or written form. Let us begin with Shafi's theory of Islamic jurisprudence. Shafi developed the unprecedented idea that the Quran and Hadith are the sole and ultimate sources of God's revealed law, against the backdrop of competing theories, which placed emphasis on other sources of the law, such as the Hanafi doctrine of Rai, legal reasoning, or Ibn Ulayya's theory of Ijma, consensus. While these elements are present in Shafi's writings, they are largely perceived as subordinate to the revealed sources of the law, the Quran and Hadith, and not as independent mechanisms of legislation. In contrast to the four sources interpretation of Shafi's jurisprudence, four sources, that is the Quran, Hadith, Rai, and Ijma, advocated by Shaft and accepted for the most part by Wa'il Halak and others, I will rely on the compelling thesis put forth by Joe Lowry, according to which the focal point of Shafi's jurisprudence rests solely on the notion of revealed law embodied in the Quran and Hadith, to the exclusion of other mechanisms of legislation. Shafi's jurisprudence was formulated, first and foremost, in contradistinction to that of his former teacher, Malik ibn Anas, died at 796, according to whom the communal practice, amal, and the ongoing collective tradition of Medina, the city of the Prophet, vouchsafed and preserved by the scholars of the city and those who received from them, ought to be regarded as an independent carrier of revelation, alongside the Quran and Hadith. The authority vested in the Medinan tradition was personal and mimetic, rather than textual and hermeneutic. The blind following of an amorphous tradition associated with Medina was viewed by Shafi as a negative form of taqlid, imitation, which he understood as the acceptance of a position without textual hermeneutic evidence. The problem with this kind of taqlid was mainly the absence of a transparent connection between a legal ruling and the normative textual evidence on which it should be based. In opposition to the non-textual legal sources of custom, practice, amal, legal reasoning, rai, and consensus, ijma, Shafi sought to ground the entirety of Islamic law in the textual authority vested in the Quran and Hadith. According to Larry, Shafi's concept of bayan, that is, the several combinations of Quran and Hadith through which God has revealed his law to humankind, lies at the heart of the jurisprudential theory presented in his Risala, the epistolal legal theory. The entirety of the law resides, therefore, in the complementarity of Quran and Hadith, while all legal rules are necessarily and by definition manifested through one of the 5 possible combinations of these sources. Quran alone, Quran and Hadith together, each expressing the same rule, Quran and Hadith together, whereby the Hadith explains what is briefly in the Quran, Hadith alone, and finally, in case God's law is not apparent in the Quran or Hadith, one ought to engage in ijtihad, legal interpretation, which is based, at least theoretically, on inferences from the Quran and Hadith. The role of ijma, consensus, in this equation is not to generate new law, but rather to validate particular legal inferences from the Quran or Hadith, and more broadly, to theologically affirm the canonical status of these works as God's revealed law. For Allah will not allow his ummah to err collectively. Please take a look at source number 4. We also know, says Shafi'i, that the entirety of them will agree neither on something contrary to the practice of God's emissary, nor on an error, God willing. As for the community, it is not possible for there to be in it as a whole heedlessness about the meaning of a scriptural proof text, a prophetic practice, or an argument based on analogy. Once again, based on analogy from the sources, the textual sources. The idea that the Quran and Hadith are the only binding and authoritative legal sources articulating the totality of God's revelation could also be seen as an argument for the binding authority of prophetic Hadith in and of itself, which is regarded as revelation on a par with the Quran. Sources 1 to 3 in your handouts exemplify the legal and theological equivalence of the Quran and Hadith in Shafi'i's thought, and their exclusive status as binding sources of the law embodying the totality of his revelation. In his recent discussion of the canonization of Islamic law, Ahmed al-Shamsi has argued that Shafi'i's work represents a watershed in Islamic jurisprudence, in the sense that the locus of legal authority is transferred from the living practice of the Muslim community to the written and increasingly demarcated canon of authoritative textual sources. Prior to Shafi'i, al-Shamsi argues, the Quran and Hadith represented the raw material of religious law, vouchsafed perhaps in some vague notion of divine revelation, but in no way regarded as the canonical manifestation of God's revealed law. These works were continually being sifted through the filters of communal experience, custom, personal legal reasoning, and consensus. The process of legal canonization validated the legal and theological status of the Quran and Hadith as the very fount of Islamic normativity and embodiment of God's revelation. What changed was not the work itself, but the way it was perceived. It was Shafi'i who forcefully advocated the exclusivity of the Quran cum Hadith as the only authoritative medium of God's revealed law. A similar theoretical model, I submit, governs the legal and theological canonization of the Mishnah and Babylonian Talmud, according to the epistle of Shriya Gaon. Whatever the authors of the Mishnah intended for it, it was likely not perceived in the centuries following its compilation as the sole and complete articulation of God's revealed oral law. Although both Talmuds, the Babylonian and Palestinian, situate the Mishnah at the center of their hermeneutical endeavor, thus reflecting a certain sense of canonicity, They consciously deviate from its rulings on the basis of other textual and non-textual sources of the law. It is only in the Geonic period that we first find the idea that the Mishnah, now alongside the Talmud, is the exclusive and complete embodiment of legal revelation. Talia Fishman has convincingly demonstrated that Shira's epistle makes unprecedented claims about the composition of the Mishnah and its legal and theological status, portraying Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Rabbi Yehuda the Patriarch, the compiler of the Mishnah, as a human agent in a divinely guided project aimed at a comprehensive textual, yet not written, articulation of the oral Torah. It is God who revealed the oral Torah to Moses, and it is he who, after many generations, guided Rebbe's compilation project, reflecting its accurate and systematic textual embodiment. The divine characteristics of the Mishnah are manifest both in its textual and stylistic perfection, as well as the providential assistance manifest in the fact that Rebbe encountered no objection or difficulty whatsoever, from within or without the rabbinic community, to hinder his ambitious compilation project. Sources 5 to 6, we don't have time to read them, in your handouts contain some of Shira's assertions to that effect. Fishman further argues that the repeated allusions in the epistle of Rav Shira to divine guidance and the perfect qualities of the Mishnah bring to mind contemporaneous Islamic discussions of the Ijaz al-Quran, a theological and literary concept describing the matchless nature of the Quranic discourse, although the term itself does not appear in the Quran. Not unlike Shira's portrayal of the Mishnah, the Quran's inimitable and miraculous nature was seen in its perfect style, the uniqueness of the Arabic language, and the Quran's brevity and conciseness, facets which are emphatically stressed throughout Shafi'i's epistle. While several Jewish authors participated in this discourse by arguing for the perfection, brevity, and conciseness of Scripture and biblical Hebrew, this is a well-known phenomenon, Rav Shira significantly extends this discourse by making similar claims about the Mishnah. This is not to suggest that the Mishnah wasn't viewed as one of several manifestations of the oral Torah, partaking in a broader notion of revealed law prior to the 10th century. It does suggest, however, that Shira's epistle is the first systematic articulation that we possess of the idea that the Mishnah is the only normative source of the law, alongside its binding, interpretation, and elaboration reflected in the Babylonian Talmud. And by the way, let me say that this is a rhetoric. It's important to note that whether the Geonim actually follow this type of discourse is another question. In other words, they might rely on many other sources of the law. But this is a rhetorical articulation of the idea that the sources of revealed law lie only in the Mishnah and Talmud. And that it represents the exclusive and complete articulation of the oral Torah, the compilation of which was guided by God himself so as to vouchsafe divine revelation in a perfect textual form. While Fishman's interpretation of Shira's account of the Mishnah's compilation is compelling, she stops short of extending her argument to Shira's description of the redaction of the Babylonian Talmud, presumably since the notions of brevity and stylistic perfection do not seem to apply to the vast corpus of the Talmud, but only to the Mishnah. But such an extension seems very likely, since the epistle maintains a clear structural and thematic equivalence between the processes that led to the compilation of the Mishnah by Rebbe and that which led to the redaction of the Babylonian Talmud by Rav Ashi and Ravina, the purported redactors of the Talmud. In this context, Shira emphasizes that just like Rebbe, Rav Ashi enjoyed the unanimous and undivided support and submissiveness of his contemporaries, while using the very same phraseology to describe the two monumental projects. Thus, for example, Shira asserts, from the time of Moses until the time of Rebbe, we do not find Torah and greatness in one and the same place. And later on he says, from the time of Rebbe to the time of Rav Ashi, we do not find Torah and greatness in one and the same place. Source 7 and 8 in your handouts contain other indications of the divine guidance and inspiration that accompanied the redaction of the Babylonian Talmud by Rav Ashi. Shira's epistle manifests, therefore, the unique legal and theological status of the Babylonian Talmud as the complete binding and canonical textual embodiment of God's oral Torah, alongside the Mishnah. This perception of the Babylonian Talmud was a Geonic innovation. To quote Robert Brody, the greatest contribution of the Geonim to the course of Jewish history was the elevation of the Babylonian Talmud to canonical status. The Talmud is an extremely complex literary work comprising legal and other materials, which evolved over several centuries. Even in its legal portions, many discussions are wholly or partly of an academic nature, and many disputes on practical issues remain unresolved. Furthermore, the material is not organized systematically in the style of a legal code. A single issue may figure in a variety of contexts, and the relationship, if any, between the various discussions, as well as the weight to be assigned to them in deriving legal conclusions, is rarely self-evident. We have no way of knowing to what extent, if at all, the editors, in parentheses, of the Talmud intended to create a normative legal work rather than an academic or literary corpus. The situation in the Geonic period was fundamentally different. The Talmud was now perceived as a closed corpus. I would only add to these astute observations that according to Shrira, the Talmud was now perceived as a closed canon not only in terms of its binding normative capacity, but also, and no less importantly, in terms of its theological characteristics, as a complete and exclusive embodiment of God's revealed law. It is in this capacity that Shrira stresses that the redaction of the Babylonian Talmud by Rav Ashi, just like the compilation of the Mishnah by Rebbe, was guided and inspired by God. All in all, Shrira presents a fascinating jurisprudential theory based on an innovative assumption of the unique legal and theological status jointly accorded to the Mishnah and Talmud as an exclusive and complete textual articulation of God's revealed law, while emphasizing that the historical process that led to the compilation of these works were guided by God himself in an attempt to vouchsafe his oral Torah in a perfect textual form, where perfect applies only to the Mishnah. The distinctive jurisprudential theory reflected in Shrira's epistle is in many ways similar to Shafi's construction of the legal and theological elevated status of the Quran and Hadith. While scholars have previously noted the interesting fact that Shrira's epistle engages in a broader Islamicate discourse concerning authority and tradition, responding to both Islamic debates concerning the Hadith, as well known, as well as Karaite challenges to rabbinic authority, the particular and detailed connections between Shrira's epistle and Shafi's Risala went by and large unnoticed in scholarship. For both authors, it is not the religious work itself that changed. The Mishnah and Quran were textually fixed before the 9th century, while the Babylonian Talmud and Hadith were well on the way of becoming textually fixed, but rather the normative and theological status of the work vis-a-vis the community. Works that were previously seen as partial and incomplete manifestations of God's law, partaking in a much broader and vague notion of revelation, were legally and theologically transformed by Shafi and Shrira into exclusive and complete articulations of God's revealed law. Both authors, moreover, employ the notion of consensus, not as a mechanism of generating new law, so much as a sign of divine guidance, affirming God's involvement in the legal process and its textual embeddedness, while theologically validating the canonical status of the revealed sources of the law. A similar jurisprudential theory is articulated by contemporaneous Zoroastrian authors, who sought to ground the canonical status of the Avesta and Zand as the exclusive and complete articulation of Ahura Mazda's revelation of his law to Zarathustra. While the Zand itself goes back to the Sasanian period, and probably even earlier, there are Old Persian interpretations of the Avesta, which are also a form of Zand. The 9th century Zoroastrian authors transformed and transcended its legal and theological status alongside the Avesta. According to the Denkard, the compilation of which began by Adolfan by son of L.L.D, high priest of the Zoroastrian community in Iran during the first half of the 9th century, and completed by Adulbad, son of Ahmed, in the 10th century, the Zand was revealed to Zarathustra in its entirety, together with the Avesta. Not unlike Rebbe's attempts to recover the content of the oral Torah revealed to Moses at Sinai, and Rav Ashi's attempts to recover the meaning and logic of the Mishnah's ruling according to Shrira, the Denkard in source 9, and once again we're not going to read it, portrays a multi-generational project of recovering the lost contents of the Avesta and Zand undertaken by a set of Iranian kings and sages, highlighting, as it were, several constitutional moments of this process. Okay, we have to cut this short. The Pahlavi Zandi wa Amanyas, in source number 10, describes a council headed by the Sasanian king Khusro that purportedly took place in the 6th century. While this passage attributes to Khusro's convention the fighting off of heresy and attempts to deal with disbelief in the authoritativeness of the Zan, another reconstruction of this very same 6th century council, found in the epistle of Manuschir, a 9th century jurist and high priest, maintains that Khusro and his council were responsible for the canonization of the Avesta and Zan, and the setting of its boundaries and legal contents. Manuschir account appears in source 11. It was like then or when Wei Shapur showed in the assembly of Khusro of Immortal Soul, king of the king's son of Khawad, the 21 divisions of the Avesta and Zan, so that the sages abided by it. And they sealed the document, so it was the way the sages agreed with it, and it has been decided. And the term they use for agreed, let me just summarize here because I'm out of time, is Hamdadistan. Hamdadistan is the very same legal term that's the equivalent of ijma, of consensus in Islamic literature. And notice here that Manuschir is using it in a theological sense, the very same way that that Shafi uses consensus. In the text we saw the very same way that Shrira uses consensus, not as a mechanism of deriving law, but as a form of theological validation of the canon itself. So Shrira and Manuschir are looking back at the 6th century, or looking back at the redaction, the supposed time where the Talmud or the Zan were redacted, and they're reflecting on this process, using this very same theological mechanism. And then he goes on, the sages agreed with all the decisions he showed to them in that matter. Okay, let me just summarize. See, I'm out of... Yeah. Okay, let me just say that it is possible to view Shrira's assertion that Rav Ashi and Ravina, the purported compilers of the Talmud, are the end of instruction, Sof Hora'ah, in the light of the Islamic notion of Muhammad's revelation as the seal of prophecy, and more specifically its exclusive embodiment in the Quran and Hadith, according to Shafi. The use of consensus, moreover, as a sign of divine guidance and theological approval of the law's textual formulation are likewise common to Shafi, Shira, and their Zoroastrian contemporaries.
Dr. Kiel will now take questions.
Well, thank you. There are some connections with what I'm going to say in a while. My commentary is about Shafi, of course. And I totally agree with you that the Risala by Shafi is an example of theologization of law, of Islamic law. My point and my question is, do you indirectly infer that this theology of law is able to explain Islamic law? Because I do feel that the role of the Shafi's Risala has always been over evaluated in the history of Islamic law. I mean, this has been the original mistake in my mind by Goldziher, by Schacht, looking at Islamic law as religious law and looking at Shafi as the cornerstone of this construction, where in the end, if we look at the literature of the Furu al-Fiqh, the construction of the Risala is never applied. I mean, it's more juristic preference, argumentation of possible adaptation of the Quran to other, the new event emerging from the society. So I just want to have your impression on the point.
So I absolutely agree with you that the notion of theologizing the law is not unique to Shafi, and perhaps even his work on this issue was overemphasized. I think what I tried to mention here and to focus on is the textualization of this notion. In other words, revealed law, theologizing the law is something that seems to have existed earlier on in Islam, and of course in the other traditions I examined as well. I think it's the issue of where the theology of the law and the jurisprudential aspects come together. In other words, this notion of legal and theological canonization come together. I think that is where Shafi is unique.
Mhm.
Thank you. I enjoyed it a lot. I'm not sure. I'm trying to think about how to formulate exactly this question. I guess a few different comments or questions. One, it's just interesting that in the what's happening in Shira is more radical because he's not returning it to the biblical. He's taking the in your equation. The Mishnah is parallel to the Quran. If I sort of understood your loose equation, and that's doubly surprising. In other words, it's doubly surprising because to the extent that there's a revealed text, it should be the Torah. And that the Mishnah certainly can be read as, although there are already rabbinic midrashim, they're going to say it's all given at Sinai, but you certainly can give an account of Mishnah as later. So I'm saying there's a double chutzpah there. It's not returning to the Torah, and it's taking the Mishnah that certainly can be conceived of as later and sort of turning it into, I don't want to misuse words here, but not the Nas, or sort of the equivalent of the Nas. I guess I have some other comments and questions, but that's enough.
Yeah, so first of all, I guess for Shrira, and this is also true for the Zoroastrian sages, there is a certain historical gap that needs to be bridged here. It doesn't really apply in the Islamic context, which is this earlier revelation, right? So the Avesta was revealed to Zarathustra, presumably hundreds or thousands of years ago, right? The same way that the Mosaic Torah was revealed to Moses in a much earlier period. And one of the questions that had to be addressed was how to bridge this gap. In other words, if God revealed his oral Torah, right, presumably according to tradition at Sinai, why is it that it was only textually manifest in the Mishnah at a much later period? And it's this historical question that Shrira and Manushtira in this case they need to bridge this gap and explain why this is happening. What happened throughout all these generations. Why the Torah doesn't function here, I think, has to do with the fact that the Torah is less of a source of the law in comparison to the Quran. The Quran is consulted as a source of law in a way that the Torah doesn't function in the rabbinic tradition. That, I assume, is the reason why Shira doesn't focus here on the Torah in that sense. Even though ultimately all law derives from the Torah was not consulted in the same way that the Quran was in terms of actually applying the law.
We have time for one more question.
Okay. Does somebody else?
No
Okay, just jump in. Just about the machloket. Would you? Because I feel like that's an interesting thing. That's maybe. I mean, again, the normal account would be over time you need to systematize. Certainly in a Karaite world, you have to. But you're saying that's true, but there's other layers to it also. So I was wondering whether the sort of erasure of machloket and shira, you think links somehow to this stuff also?
Yeah, that's absolutely another aspect of this whole discussion, which I did not address today. But there's actually a significant shift from the late Sasanian to the Abbasid period in all these legal traditions. And let me just add in the Syriac tradition as well, where a certain idea of pluralism in the law, I don't want to go into detail here, is replaced by a growing sense of unanimity. Within the rabbinic tradition, the idea of L.L.D is gradually replaced alongside this process of systematization of the Talmud. Is placed by this idea of unanimity. Whether it's actually applied is another issue. Again, this is a rhetorical statement, but the view of unanimity changes, and this is happening in the Zoroastrian tradition as well. A certain perspective of pluralistic law that is true in the Zan of the late Sasanian period is gradually replaced by a more monolithic understanding of the law, or the way the law is supposed to function. And this is also happening in a similar manner in the Syriac tradition. Specifically, Ishabach in the 8th century says that he wrote his legal code, the first of this nature in Syriac, which was translated from Middle Persian. He says he first wrote this code because every bishop in every province is just deciding according to whatever they want, and the law has to be systematized. This pluralistic way of generating law can no longer exist. And so this is similar to happening in all these traditions. Of course, this has to do with broader historical processes, the emergence of Islam and so on. But we could detect this in all the different cultural discussion.
Thank you so much.